Architecture is a funny word when talking about virtual spaces, because much of our real-world understanding of architecture is built around the laws of reality. Physics, for example, or the availability of different construction materials. And I spend much of my time thinking about spaces that only exist virtually, where pesky things like physics and resource scarcity don't apply. But despite these massive differences, I found that my work with virtual spaces has informed my understanding of real ones. It's made me aware of a sense that, whether we know it or not, is affecting all of us all the time. My name is Jacob Geller. I'm a writer and video producer for YouTube, where I write essays on a lot of stuff. Many of them start with games, but never in a vacuum. Instead, I try to use games as a lens to educate folks on everything, from still life paintings to grisly medical procedures to modern political thought. But through 60 plus videos, which have been cumulatively viewed more than 45 million times, I keep coming back to the idea of virtual spaces and how those spaces affect us. How do they shape our behavior? How do they frame our emotions? Video games are an excellent place to study these aspects of design because of the specificity of their space's purpose. One of the more enthralling elements of a game is simply having a goal and knowing that the space you're in has most likely been designed to help you achieve that goal. Something we probably all wish was a little clearer in real life. This goal-centered design, paired with the artificiality of the world it happens in, means that it's fairly easy to intuit why a specific choice was made. For example, say you're walking through the world of a video game, spot a prominent house on a large hill, and decide to walk towards it. Nothing in this scene is by accident. The designers almost certainly made that house prominent specifically to draw your eye. They created the hill itself so the house would be easy to see. They maybe even specifically designed the lighting, the weather and time of day, just so that house would be highlighted. Although it may feel like you made a spontaneous decision to walk towards that house, your choice has been invisibly sculpted by the architecture of the space you're walking through. Sometimes the artificiality of this design is easier to spot. Let's say you're playing a level in a suburban neighborhood, reach the end, and right next to the neighborhood is a giant racetrack. It's perfectly clear what the game designers would like you to do next. Hop in that race car, it's time to go fast. But sometimes, the goals of a space are felt more subtly. Many third-person shooting games, like the Gears of War or Uncharted series, rely heavily on combat that encourages the player to crouch behind a wall, wait until an enemy finishes shooting, and then emerge from that cover and shoot back. This is the way the game designers want you to play. And to facilitate this, combat encounters are often sprinkled with waist-high walls, perfectly shaped objects for you to take cover behind. The art of a level often tries to disguise these waist-high walls. An ancient temple might feature large ruins littering the floor, whereas a level in an office building could have liberally placed desks and cubicles. However, if you spend enough time playing these games, you start to see past the decorations. The ruins might look different than the office furniture, but we as players understand their true purpose. It's all just cover to hide from enemies behind. The more of this type of game you play, the more recognizable the setup becomes. When I first played these games, I sometimes noticed I was more on edge in specific rooms. Now I recognize why. Even if the space was painted to look like an office building or an ancient ruin, I was subconsciously registering that really, behind the decoration, the architecture of this place was designed for combat. Now, one of the reasons I like talking about our sense of space in video games and virtual spaces is that once you enter the real world, things get significantly more complicated. Games allow a sort of self-centered analysis where almost everything exists for us in one way or another. In reality, I can't assume that every time I see a house on a hill, there's a grand design hinting that I should go that direction. But just like the virtual spaces we've talked about, real-life architecture shapes our behavior and feelings in ways both subtle and dramatic. Just like in games, this influence happens whether we're conscious of it or not. So let's use the same analytical skills we practiced on the simple worlds of games and start asking questions about the architecture of our world. Previously, I used the very video gamey example of a neighborhood that borders a racetrack. But actually, this isn't too far from places I've lived. I spent years in a house that felt like my driveway exited directly onto a racing circuit where cars would tear past at all times of day. This house was actually pretty close to a number of stores, and yet I almost never walked anywhere. On the other side of the coin, I've also lived places where I walked miles a day, far more than I would have guessed I'd be comfortable with. If we don't examine the architecture surrounding us, my behavior is kind of a mystery. I guess there were just some points in my life where I walked more. Who knows? But if we give this phenomenon the same treatment as we did with virtual spaces, the factors behind my varying amount of walking is fairly obvious. When I walked miles a day, I lived in a place with wide sidewalks, generous crosswalks, and tons of other pedestrians. All of my surroundings signaled that walking was the preferred method of getting from point A to point B, and the architecture of that place held plenty of advantages for moving with my own 2 feet. In contrast, my home that exited onto a racetrack made me feel silly for even considering walking. The roads felt dangerous and sidewalks were non-existent. In fact, I sometimes felt like I should have been a car, because that's what seemingly everything around me had been designed for. Living in these different places, I behaved in completely opposite ways because each environment was sending me unwritten but very clear messages about its intended usage. It's easiest for us to sense the implicit goals of a built environment when that environment's purpose is singular. A great example of this is something like an elementary school. Even if you took all the posters off the wall and people out of the building, I think we'd all be able to pretty quickly determine the purpose of this space. Tables arranged for group work, cubbies, really small toilets. On the infrequent occasion that I've been in a school building used for something else, voting for instance, there's almost an uncanny feeling to the whole experience. It's not bad per se, but I can definitely sense that something's a little off. This on its own is harmless and a fun little demonstration at how good we are at picking up the signals architecture sends us. However, the same skill can take us in a significantly more morbid direction if we look at the construction of new schools in the United States. Because, as we are all unfortunately aware, violence and shootings have become an unignorable part of the American school experience. For decades now, classes have practiced active shooter drills and teachers have been given emergency protocols. In modern times, however, efforts to reduce risk have extended to the architecture of the schools themselves. New school buildings in the US boast such features as bullet-resistant glass, walking paths with limited sight lines, even hard concrete barricades built into the halls themselves. Each of these elements is, I'm sure, created with good intentions. The goal is to minimize student risk in a worst-case scenario, and I respect that school administrators feel they have to do something when our larger political machine is unwilling to. But when I hear about these new goals of school architecture, I immediately flash back to those rooms in video games filled with waist-high walls. How even if nothing was happening, I felt a little nervous, a little on edge. I think about how effectively built environments have shaped my own behavior and attitudes in the past, and I worry about the implicit signals students in schools built like fortresses are receiving. None of us have a choice on if we want to receive messages from a built environment. It happens, whether we're conscious of it or not. However, we can choose to actively analyze our surroundings, to ask questions about how they impact us and how this impact changes our view of the world. I found that virtual spaces worked as a sort of training ground, giving me simpler worlds to ask questions that could then be expanded to our real one. You may find a different route to awakening this sense. You certainly don't need to play Gears of War to have concerns about school design. But I do urge you to think about the ways we're shaped by the architecture around us. Do not be passive in your experience of an environment, because it's only after recognizing our influences that we can work to change them. Thank you very much.